A cold wind pushed through the lee of a canvas wall. Inside the tent, a map lay half-creased across a low table. Horsehair boots leaned where they had been shrugged off, and a cup cooled beside the sleeping figure of a commander. He had spent the day moving men and horses across that stretch of steppe, and little had loosened from his jaw the certainty that the world belonged to the army that rode it. Night kept its usual watch. Stars, the distant calls of sentries, the low breathing of men who trusted in iron and numbers. A shadow slid at the edge of the lamp's glow. It moved with the patience of someone who had learned to be patient for a single purpose. The figure did not trumpet its arrival with trumpets or banners. It closed the flap, stepped past a sleeping courier, and stood over the commander with a small blade. By dawn, the man whose duty had been to command thousands would be found with a narrow wound and no shout to mark his end. A small token, reported by some chroniclers as a sign of the killer's allegiance, was left in the tent, a message that said more loudly than any war drum, "We can reach you." How did a secret order of killers turn the Mongol army, an army bred on shock, speed, and spectacle, into an assembly that feared the night within its own camp? That question sits at the center of this story. It is a clash between two kinds of power. One loud and visible, the other intimate and invisible. Each method had its own logic. Each found ways to exploit the vulnerabilities of the other. To understand how fear moved from the hills and into the folds of Mongol canvas, we must see both sides clearly. The Mongols were, from their origins, masters of what we might call organized mobility. They did not fight as kingdoms fought, lined up and waiting for the moment of contact. Their strength came from horses, from endurance, and from a command system honed for moving numbers of men across vast distances with unerring precision. Units were arranged in decimal structure, tens and hundreds and thousands, so orders could move quickly without confusion. A rider dispatched by a leader could be certain his message would be delivered, and a company could be reassembled with little delay. Horses were replaced, not rested. Men swapped mounts as they needed to. They were cavalry built to march farther and faster than any foe imagined. This mobility translated into warfare as a kind of kinetic psychology. The Mongol army made spectacle part of strategy. They displayed captives on stakes, raised settlements as warning, and used the fear of annihilation as a weapon to make opponents surrender before battle. Contemporary observers described cities falling at the sight of Mongol standards. Governors opened gates rather than test the storms of arrows and flame. The Mongol approach to terror was public. A pyramid of skulls at a gate, a town burned and sent as a message to the next town. It was designed to be seen and to induce immediate surrender. In that logic, terror multiplied force. If everyone ran, fewer soldiers need be risked. That same logic, however, relied on a binary of public and private. The Mongols fought on the open steppe as any ruler might expect. Enemies arrayed, banners visible, lines broken. Their power assumed a visibility. The enemy's breakdown was meant to be demonstrable. By contrast, the killers who haunted the hills of Iran and Syria at the time of the Mongol advance chose invisibility. They made threats that could not be paraded in the daylight because their effectiveness depended on leaving nothing to parade. They preferred the hush of a tent to the thunder of battle. The organization behind those knives had its center in a place the Mongols would later know by name, Alamut. High in the mountains, cliff face to cliff face, a fortress citadel rose on a screen of rock, a place of concealment and study. Its master, in the late 11th century, was a figure named Hassan ibn Sabah. He did not win power through the standard measures of territory and charismatic warbands. Instead, he built a reputation through a mixture of religious zeal, political savvy, and disciplined secrecy. Under his leadership, Alamut became the seedbed of a network that practiced targeted violence as a tool of politics. That tool was not random bloodletting. The group we call the Hashashin, an epithet that would carry into the languages of their neighbors, crafted a doctrine of elimination that aimed at specific people and moments. Where armies destroyed towns and governments by overwhelming force, these operatives sought to remove the individual who stood between their patrons and a desired policy or outcome. A vizier, a provincial ruler, a crusader with a crown. By excising key figures at carefully chosen moments, they could shift power like a surgeon, changing the balance of a machine. Training at Alamut, as chroniclers relate, combined religious instruction with practical tradecraft. Recruits were schooled in discipline and secrecy. They learned to move among crowds unnoticed, to find access to the intimate places where a leader slept or dined. They practiced patience until patience itself became an instrument. They honed small blades and the arts of disguise, and they developed a communal language of signs and tokens to communicate success. Many contemporary accounts, some written by enemies, describe how members would approach a target as a guest or a servant, commit the act, and then escape the scene amid the confusion. Some reports say tokens or symbols were left, meant to identify the deed and its political meaning. Historians debate some of these details. The exact rituals and the scale of these practices are recorded unevenly in the sources. Yet the pattern is clear. The aim was to make high politics vulnerable to low, private violence. There is a temptation in recounting these episodes to dramatize the killers as mythic figures, a secret order with mystical rites. Some chroniclers, writing decades or centuries after events, filled in gaps with tales that paint the group as otherworldly. Among the more colorful assertions are claims about narcotics or controlled visions inducing fanatical devotion before assignments. Those claims appear in several medieval sources. Scholars today caution that such narratives often served as exoticizing shorthand used by opponents or fascinated travelers. Whether drugs, ritual, or strict discipline, what mattered was the result. The order produced agents who could move unseen and strike without warning. For the Mongols, the first inkling that an enemy had learned the inner geography of its camps was disorienting. Their methods of terror demanded an enemy be visible, to be seen falling or surrendering under the weight of the Mongol onslaught. Here, however, was a campaign that made no bodies to parade, no columns to topple publicly. Imagine a commander who had won battles by trusting in mass and mobility, now feeling that his sleep had become as dangerous as his march. The assassinations, when they struck, introduced a psychological variable the Mongol war machine had not prioritized, the fear of personal vulnerability. A few episodes stand out in the chronicles from the period when East and West met on the borderlands of empire. One account, whose details vary across sources, says a Mongol officer was found murdered in his tent at night, a narrow wound marking his throat, and a token placed upon his person. Another report claims a messenger carrying instructions to a provincial governor did not arrive. His horse returned riderless. These stories circulated among troops as whispers and then as a pattern. It did not take many such incidents, especially in the close quarters of a campaign, for suspicion to sprout like weeds. Who among the camp's servants could be trusted? Which of the men in the warm tents was an enemy-turned-traitor? Paranoia is contagious. It spreads faster than cavalry. This is the moment where asymmetry becomes not only tactical, but psychological. The Mongol army could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors, move them with little notice, and bring them to bear on a fortress in weeks. The assassins could not field armies. They had no massed banners, and they did not seek pitched battle. Their effectiveness turned on the ability to transform a public instrument, terror used in mass, into a private vulnerability. The idea that a man of power could be removed with a single, precise action in his most intimate space. How did that translate into practice on campaign? The sources vary, but the contours are familiar. A commander's advisor might be stripped of certainty. A colonel might refuse to camp near the water, fearing infiltration among the servants. Guards were doubled at night. Men who might once have slept in open confidence found themselves counting the threads in their tents. The Mongol response cannot be overstated. When the fear was of an open field, they responded as they always did, by bringing more force and making examples. But fear of an unseen hand required different tools: counterintelligence, screening of servants, and extreme punishments to deter collaborators. Those measures, when they followed, often bore costs that extended beyond the immediate military calculus. It is tempting to think of tactics as simply clever means to secure ends, yet tactics always have human consequences. When a commander orders public executions to root out collaborators, entire communities can be crushed in the attempt to shake out one thread. Reprisal can become an instrument of law, and law can degrade into terror. Chronicles from provincial towns report reprisals that destroyed families and economic life. At their worst, they turned reluctant civilians into enemies who had nothing left to lose. The moral calculus was grim. A short-term measure to secure a camp could generate long-term hostility and suffering among the populations on which supply and intelligence depended. Those costs, historians remind us, are part of any story of asymmetric warfare. To see how these dynamics played out, we must look at the meeting point of two historical arcs. On one hand, the Mongol eastward campaigns under the Great Khan's mandate were an expression of imperial momentum, a desire to secure trade routes, to subdue rival powers, and to assert the Khan's hegemony across the West. On the other, the order from Alamut had, for more than a century, refined a system of removal that was surgical rather than sweeping. The collision between them would not be merely a military contest of field versus fortress. It would be a contest of how power is claimed and enforced. As the Mongols pushed into Persia and Syria, news of the secret order's hits reached the commander's tent with an intensity that changed the tenor of command. Imagine the whisper of an aide who brings a fresh report: another officer dead in an allied garrison, another envoy who never returned from a city council. Officers who had relied on displays of power now had to consider who could get close enough to their beds at night. The campaign's momentum, so dependent on timely communication and personal bravery, slowed under the weight of doubt. Those doubts altered decisions. When a leader fears assassination, he delegates less and trusts fewer. That can harden lines of command, but it can also impair flexibility. The Mongol advantage, quick reaction, decentralized but disciplined command, was blunted when local commanders worried that their messengers, their cooks, or their tent attendants might be instruments of death. Paranoia breeds procedures: food tasters, inner barracks, rotation of guards. Some chroniclers note such measures, historians debate their scale and effectiveness. Still, the pattern is unmistakable. The presence of a capable, unseen adversary forces a military to redirect resources from offense to protection. The assassins did not rely solely on slaying to advance their cause. Their operations were embedded in networks of information and patronage. A removal completed at the right moment could be followed by diplomatic maneuvers that exploited the vacancy. The death of a governor, for example, might open negotiations that would favor a client or an ally. The operation's real power lay in timing and the political aftershocks it created. The consequence for the Mongols was double. Not only had their soldiers to fight the prospect of a blade in the night, but the commanders had to contend with a shifting political landscape where an intimate act could have outsized strategic consequences. Not all historians agree on the scale to which the order could influence larger political outcomes, and the evidence often comes from sources that had reasons to exaggerate or to demonize. A local chronicler might ascribe to the assassins a causal power larger than warranted, while a foreign observer might tell the tale to explain away sudden political changes. Recognizing this, modern scholars read the sources critically. They look for corroboration, for the echoes of an event across multiple accounts, and for the context that makes a reported assassination plausible. Where the evidence is thin, cautious phrasing is necessary. Where multiple sources agree, a stronger claim can be made. The Mongols, for their part, had their own logic of retribution. Public spectacle, mass execution, display of heads, destruction of towns, was not merely cruelty for cruelty's sake, but calculated strategy. The spectacle was a bargaining chip. It said to others, "Submission spares you, resistance brings ruin." This logic, however, did not translate easily into fighting an enemy whose instrument was silence. The rule, "be overwhelming," had to be adapted when the enemy was not a city to be stormed, but an idea that could persist in shadow. There are recorded instances where Mongol commanders reacted with brutal clarity. When they identified suspected collaborators, they did not hesitate to make an example. At times, accounts say, whole neighborhoods were executed. At other times, a single prominent family bore the weight of punishment. Such responses succeeded in certain tactical ways. They deterred some conspirators, they quenched local support networks, and they signaled to others the price of aiding invisible killers. But the collateral damage was severe. Civilians, who might have provided food, guides, or intelligence, were instead driven into resentment or flight. Medieval chronicles recount towns emptied and fields neglected because the fear of reprisal made cooperation impossible. Ethical considerations aside, the strategy had strategic costs. Armies complex to sustain in hostile territory depend on those who live there, and crushing those populations can cut supply lines and intelligence channels as surely as enemy raids. Within that interplay of shadows and spectacle, small moments carried large symbolic weight. A body found near a command tent suggested not just that someone had been killed, but that the sanctity of command had been violated. Soldiers who previously measured their lives in the heat of battle now had to reckon with the fact that victory in the field did not guarantee safety in the night. This psychological reversal is central to understanding how fear propagated through Mongol ranks. The open terror of the Mongols failed to inoculate them against the intimate terror of the assassins. Where the Mongol terror produced capitulation, the assassins produced a different collapse, the erosion of trust. Yet trust is not fragile only in armies. It is fragile in cities too. When a sultan or a governor discovered that an aide had been removed, the ripple effects up and down the administration altered alliances and appointments. A political order built on patronage could be reshaped by a single well-timed removal, and that reshaping could, in turn, create openings for the Mongols. The result was a layered conflict in which the assassins sometimes acted as spoilers of alliances that might otherwise have united against the eastern invaders, and sometimes as independent political actors seeking to protect their own enclaves. It is important to remember that this story does not have a single moral ledger. The assassins' actions created terror, but they did so with a tactical logic and, often, a narrow political aim. The Mongol response produced reprisals that hurled terror back into civilian life, sometimes indiscriminately. Both sides inflicted suffering, and both operated within strategic logics that treated human life as an instrument of policy. Contemporary chroniclers, whether sympathetic or hostile, recorded scenes of grief and ruin, families uprooted, markets shuttered, and the slow death of social networks. Those costs are as much a part of the narrative as banners and blades. By the time Hulagu Khan assembled his western force, the stage was set for an intensified clash. The Great Khan had authorized a campaign to secure the West, an operation that would bring tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and resources into Persian lands and beyond. Commanders planned logistics, couriers set schedules, and the rumble of migration began. For the men at Alamut and their allies, the approaching storm represented an unprecedented challenge. For the Mongols, the presence of a secret network capable of striking inside their camps posed an existential upset. An army that prided itself on invincibility found itself unsettled by unseen hands. Word traveled slowly across the mountains and fast along the camp corridors. An officer in a regional garrison had been struck down in the night. A courier bearing orders failed to deliver his message. The same token, reported in various chronicles as the mark of the assassins, had been found again. Some commanders saw a pattern and sounded alarms. Others dismissed the rumors as morale-sapping legends. But rumors have a power of their own in war. They shaped decisions, influenced where forces were deployed, and altered the rhythms of campaign life. The Mongol command had to decide whether to treat these incidents as isolated crimes or as a symptom of an organized campaign that must be confronted. Conversations that perhaps took place behind closed doors began to leak into the public record. Advisors argued about whether to pursue punitive expeditions against suspected towns that harbored the killers, whether to change encampment protocols, how to secure the routes of communication that made Mongol mobility their greatest strength. Those were not merely logistical debates. They were debates about how to respond to fear itself. When you cannot see your enemy clearly, do you seek him in the open with overwhelming force, or do you attempt to root him from the shadowy spaces where he thrives? Some commanders leaned into spectacle. If private killings undermined public authority, then public punishment might be the clearest remedy. Demonstrate power so unequivocally that no one would entertain aiding an assassin. Others counseled restraint for fear of punishing innocents and alienating a population whose cooperation would be necessary for long-term control. Chronicles reflect both impulses. In some regions, brutal reprisals followed. In others, more cautious measures, curfews, interrogations, and surveillance, were tried. The record is scattered and uneven, as historical records often are. But the debate itself is significant. It reveals that the problem posed by the assassins was not only tactical, but moral and political. Meanwhile, the order behind the blades did not operate in a vacuum. Alamut was not a single fortress, but part of a network of fortresses and cells, local allies and patrons who had an interest in maintaining a balance of power. The men and women who carried out killings did so, knowing they might provoke responses that would bring down extreme retribution. That did not always deter action. Sometimes the strategic gains, real or perceived, outweighed the potential cost. Other times the cost was brutal and immediate. Towns laid waste in retribution, families executed as collaborators, supply lines severed. Such outcomes illustrate the unavoidable truth of asymmetric conflict. The privileged ability to inflict targeted damage creates choices that cascade into broader violence. As the Mongol columns drew closer and the assassinations continued, the tension within camps mounted. Sentries paced longer watches. Advisors questioned the loyalty of courtiers. Small incidents, an unlit lamp, a missing servant, sparked disproportionate fears. The Mongols were disciplined soldiers, but discipline depends on cohesion, on trust that orders will be carried, and that men will not cut off the head of the chain in secret. The assassin's method, removing the chain's links one by one, worked to erode that cohesion. Commanders who had once relied on speed and decisive action found themselves confronted by a problem that demanded patience, subtlety, and a willingness to accept moral compromises. At the edge of this conversation lay a question too large to answer quickly. Could overwhelming force reassert dominance over a network that preferred darkness? In the Mongol calculus, the answer tended toward a single move: crush the nodes that sustain the network. That meant sieges, blockades, and the targeted destruction of the places where the order had its roots. But before a siege could be mounted, paths had to be secured, supply lines protected, and local intelligence gathered. and to gather intelligence against an enemy who excelled at concealment required breaking the very tissues of local society. The paradox was blunt. To eliminate a secret threat by open violence risked turning the secret into a wider insurgency. In the next phase of this story, commanders would choose courses that revealed which of these logics they favored: spectacle or subterfuge, immediate example or patient root and branch dismantlement. But those decisions had not yet been finalized. At the moment when Mongol standards fluttered on the horizon, and when whispers in camp circles mentioned blades left in tents, both sides were taking measure of one another. Night fell across the tents. Inside some, men joked to mask unease. In others, commanders turned over maps as if in impossible calculation. On a mountain not far from the road, a cliff fortress stood quiet and calculated, its stone walls sealing corridors where messengers moved like veins. Between the open steppe and the secret stronghold, an invisible battle of wills was already underway. The assassin's blade had reached a Mongol pillow. The Mongol response would be decisive, but it would not be simple. The stakes were not only territory or tribute, they were the terms on which fear itself would be used or disarmed. Night settled across the encampment like a held breath. Fires guttered low, the clink of armor came only from the sentry rotations. Somewhere beyond the ring of tent light, a courier unrolled a fresh report and swallowed the words on the page as if they might burn him. The news was never a single blade. It arrived as a pattern. An officer found with a narrow wound, a messenger who failed to return, a token in a tent that fed rumor into rumor, until rumor hardened into policy. If you love deep history like this, subscribe and join us for more episodes that dig into the shadows of the past. The immediate collisions between the Mongol columns and the networks tied to Alamut unfolded in small, sharp strokes before they became a campaign. It was not a traditional front line. It was a geography of access, roads and river crossings, caravans and caravanserais, the thin spine of mountain passes where a courier must pass and a watchman choose whether to look. The assassins did not try to meet Mongol horses in open battle. They probed the connective tissue of command. Their earliest strikes against Mongol personnel and allied administrators had a double aim: to disrupt immediate decision-making and to plant doubt in the hearts of officers whose confidence had always been an instrument of victory. One vignette recurs in multiple accounts, though each source dresses its edges differently. A regional commander, known for his effectiveness in forcing cities to surrender, was set to ride out the next morning for a reconnaissance. That night, a servant, someone in the tent who had been allowed by custom and by the trust of long campaign life, slid a small blade between ribs and departed as if nothing had happened. The discovery at dawn did more than remove a man. It reframed the camp. It suggested that proximity and familiarity were not guarantees of loyalty. It suggested that the Mongols' strength on the field did not extend to the privacy of a tent. For commanders, the tactical implications were immediate. Couriers became liabilities. Service personnel, cooks, water-bearers, interpreters could not be taken for granted. The Mongol solution was pragmatic and brutal in equal measure: increase security, double guards, and punish suspected conspirators with an eye toward deterrence. Where that failed, spectacle returned. Public executions meant to reassert the visibility of Mongol power. But spectacle could never fully substitute for the kind of intelligence work necessary to unmask a hidden network. To catch a ghost requires patient watchers, informants, and resources diverted from campaigning to policing. These responses altered the rhythm of Mongol operations. The army that had prized speed, riders sent at all hours, orders transmitted by relay, found itself slowed by the need to vet messengers and secure encampments. That slowness had strategic consequences. Delays seeded opportunities for the defenders of fortresses to improve their positions. For officers in the field, a day's hesitation could become a week's delay. and for a force that relied on momentum to overwhelm opponents. Momentum in many directions meant vulnerabilities in others. As the incidents accumulated, the Mongol reaction hardened into a strategic choice. Facing an enemy that thrived on concealment, some commanders argued that the only reliable remedy was to seek out and destroy the nodes that sustained it. That logic pointed inexorably at Alamut and the ring of fortresses that dotted the surrounding mountains. It required a campaign unlike previous Mongol raids, a patient, resource-intensive operation of siegecraft and isolation. Hulagu Khan's western expedition, sanctioned by the Great Khan, brought to the forefront exactly the kind of force that could attempt such an operation. His columns moved with the usual combination of cavalry, infantry, and engineers. They carried an eye toward logistics that included not only horses and grain, but the tools of siege. Where the assassins expected the cover of local terrain and the inconvenience of pursuit, the Mongol answer combined mobility with prepared instruments for breaching stone. Still, taking Alamut would not be a simple display of brute force. The fortress occupied a position engineered for resilience. Perched on cliffs, with narrow approaches and plentiful storehouses, it lent itself to withstand short campaigns and to wait for relief from allies who might not come. The Mongols, terrain-savvy, adaptable, responded in multiple ways. They methodically cut supply routes, secured surrounding valleys, and moved to compress the fortress into a smaller and smaller space. They also engaged in a campaign of political attrition, pressuring local lords, courting defectors, and using the carrot of clemency for those who would abandon the defense. In private councils, Mongol commanders weighed the efficacy of storming walls against the benefits of forcing a surrender that left them fewer logistical headaches. Chronicles from the period record a mixture of siegecraft and diplomacy. Some accounts emphasize the use of siege engines, machines that hurled stones and fire into positions that seemed impregnable because of steep access. Others note that negotiations, bribes, and offers of safe conduct helped to fracture the alliances that kept outlying fortresses supplied. Historians remain cautious about assigning a single decisive instrument. What stands out in the record is the combination: field engineers, a blockade of roads, and political pressure. At the same time, the Mongols continued to confront the abiding problem the assassins posed: secrecy. They tried to sever the networks that transmitted intelligence to Alamut. Where spies and envoys once slipped through, the Mongols instituted interrogations and inspections. In some places, this manifested as careful questioning and monitoring of caravan traffic. In others, it took the form of spectacular and brutal reprisals aimed at deterring collaboration. The ethics of such acts are grave and the human cost immediate. When a town suspected of sheltering agents was punished, families were often caught in the sweep, men and women taken as suspects, property destroyed, markets ruined. These measures sometimes produced short-term security, but often at the cost of alienating the same population whose cooperation might have produced long-term stability. Within Alamut and the Nizari network, the arrival of Hulagu's forces presented its own dilemmas. The leadership faced the prospect that continued resistance could draw down explosive Mongol reprisals on surrounding communities. At issue was a political calculus: maintain honor and autonomy at the risk of total destruction, or negotiate terms that might preserve some element of the community. Reports suggest that divisions existed among the defenders, some urging bold resistance, others counsel for survival. It is important to stress that much of what we know of these internal debates comes to us through sources that had motives of their own. Victors have a tendency to reshape the narrative, and local chroniclers sometimes added retrospective moral framing to justify choices. One of the most consequential episodes in this collision of logics was the surrender or capture of leaders associated with Alamut. A prominent figure, referred to in some sources as Rukn al-Din, emerges in the record as a man whose decisions mattered. Chronicles differ on motive and method. Some versions portray a negotiated surrender under promises of clemency. Others describe a capitulation precipitated by internal betrayal and the collapse of potential relief. Modern historians stress the uncertainty of details. The broad pattern, a fortress isolated, its leaders compelled to choose between resistance and accommodation, remains clear, but the particulars are often contested and must be treated cautiously. When Alamut fell in the mid-13th century, the event had symbolic resonance beyond the material capture of walls and stores. For the Mongols, it was a statement. An institution that had specialized in overthrowing rulers by furtive means had been exposed and dismantled by overwhelming public force. For the defenders, the fall was a rupture. Communities that had long anchored themselves to a spiritual and political order suddenly found themselves in a landscape of new dominion. The destruction of fortifications and the dispersal of surviving members signaled the end of a particular kind of centralized capacity to project assassination as policy. But it did not erase the idea, nor did it eliminate the skills and methods whose use could be repurposed by others. The process of dismantling Alamut's network illustrates a key lesson of counterinsurgency in pre-modern terms. Isolating a covert organization often entailed a campaign of civic rupture. To choke off supplies, the Mongol commanders had to sever ties between fortresses and their hinterlands. To compel surrender, they had to offer incentives for elites to switch sides. To prevent the reconstitution of the network, they had to either exterminate potential supporters or integrate them into the new order. Each of these moves had immediate strategic logic, but equally immediate social costs. Military engineers and siege crews played a visible role, but so did the less visible operations. The planting of informants, the negotiated transfers of loyalty among provincial lords, and the creation of administrative structures that reoriented local power toward Mongol sway. When a fortress that had once relied on a network of informants and allies to sustain itself found that those ties frayed under the pressure of occupation and offer of clemency, its capacity to coordinate clandestine operations plunged. The Mongol goal was not simply to take stone, it was to sever the human channels that kept the order alive. One consequence of this campaign was an intensification of reprisals and measures that bled civilian life. Towns suspected of harboring sympathizers were sometimes punished in gruesome ways that contemporary chroniclers detail with horror. Families were displaced, agricultural cycles were interrupted, merchants avoided once thriving routes. These are not side effects to be glossed over. They represent the concrete human toll of a strategy that treated populations as both the means and the object of warfare. Any account that celebrates the solution to a security problem must reckon with these costs. Even as Alamut fell, the practice of assassination did not vanish overnight. Cells, agents, and skilled individuals dispersed into new geographies. The knowledge embedded in their tradecraft, how to blend, how to move at night, how to gain trust, survived because it was not tied to a single building. In some regions, the order's remnants adapted to new political pressures, aligning with or submitting to new masters. In others, the idea of targeted, disruptive acts lived on in the strategies of groups seeking to influence high politics without presenting a conventional military threat. The post-Alamut period also revealed a paradox of violence and memory. The Mongol annihilation of visible infrastructure could not erase stories and reputations embedded in the social imagination. Tales of precise, intimate removals, of blades in tents and envoys who never reached their posts, persisted in chronicles and oral histories. These memories preserved an image of the assassins as an instrument of political agency, even as the order's material capacities curtailed. Over the long arc of history, the method's symbolic capital outlived the fortress's stones. What then was the ultimate balance in the clash? The Mongols demonstrated that overwhelming force, combined with patient siegecraft and political inducement, could dismantle an institution that relied on secrecy and concentrated nodes. They showed that when a state, or an imperial military, applies sustained, coordinated pressure on the logistical and social supports of a covert network, that network's ability to operate at scale can be severely curtailed. Yet the assassins revealed that asymmetry grants an effect disproportionate to size. A few well-placed killings could redirect policy, unsettle alliances, and compel enemies to divert resources to defense. This is the core of the story. The assassins spread fear through the Mongol forces not simply by taking lives, but by altering perceptions of safety and trust. The image of a blade in the night did what 100 broken battalions could not. It made commanders doubt the loyalty of those around them, slowed the tempo of operations, and forced a redistribution of effort from offense to security. Fear, in this case, was not an abstract mood. It was an operational constraint. The Mongol adaptation, massive sieges, political isolation, public punishment, was effective insofar as it removed the centralized capacity of the order. But it did so at cost. Reprisals and the crushing of civilian life inflicted wounds that outlasted the military victory. Communities dislocated, economies damaged, and relationships severed. In that sense, both parties weaponized fear. The assassins used it to produce leverage in the high politics of the region. The Mongols used it to attempt dissuasion and to exact compliance. The result was a cycle in which the attempt to neutralize fear sometimes propagated more fear in the civilian sphere. There are important cautions to keep in mind when we assess the narrative. Many of the more dramatic claims about ritualized behavior among the assassins and the precise mechanics of every killing come from sources written long after the events, or from observers with axes to grind. Claims about drug use, secret rites, or a monolithic, centrally directed cult are recorded in some chronicles but remain contested among modern scholars. Similarly, while the broad arc of Alamut's isolation and eventual capture is well attested, the precise sequence of negotiations, betrayals, and military operations varies across accounts. Where the chronicle tradition disagrees, historians today read with a critical eye and avoid turning contested detail into settled fact. This complexity matters for how we understand legacy. To reduce the story to a simple moral, stealth beats force, force beats stealth, would be to miss the interaction of strategy, politics, and social consequence that made this period so consequential. The practical innovations associated with the order, the use of targeted killing as a political tool, the cultivation of agents who could move in civilian garb, and the capacity to leverage assassination for diplomatic ends, left methodological echoes in later centuries. At the same time, the Mongol response revealed a durable lesson for state actors confronting irregular threats. That when a covert network depends on local support and logistical ties, those ties can be severed through a combination of military pressure and political realignment, albeit at potentially severe human cost. The memory of the conflict also shaped neighboring polities' approaches to security. Rulers who observed the Mongol campaigns and the assassins' work recognized that protecting high-value individuals required more than bodyguards. It required a rethinking of the relationship between rulership and population. Some responded by tightening access to elites and expanding the role of trusted servants. Others sought to cultivate their own intelligence networks. Such adaptations were uneven and often reflected the limits of resources and the peculiarities of local politics. It is tempting, in reflecting on this history, to reach for tidy contemporary analogies. The temptation should be resisted. The medieval Middle East, its institutions, social structures, and technologies differs in crucial ways from modern states. But reading the past carefully can illuminate recurring dynamics. The interplay between visible and invisible coercion, the temptation of reprisal, and the enduring reality that methods which protect short-term security can undermine long-term stability by alienating civilian populations. In that sense, the Mongol assassin confrontation offers a case study in the ethics and efficacy of asymmetric conflict. To return, finally, to the tent at the edge of the camp. A man once slept with the confidence that his position and the power around him made him safe. A blade changed that calculus. The assassin's power was not to field armies, but to rearrange attention. They made private spaces suspect, and by doing so, they forced a recalculation across the Mongol command structure. The Mongol response, unyielding siege, public reprisals, and the political dismantling of support networks, was effective at destroying what the order had built in stone and organization. Yet the idea persisted. Targeted removal of leaders retained a strategic allure because it affected decisions at the highest levels for modest expenditure. The moral balance is not clean. Lives were taken, communities destroyed, and the politics of fear reshaped entire regions. Those outcomes force us to ask hard questions about the responsibilities of power. When a state confronts an asymmetric threat, what limits should apply to the remedies chosen? When clandestine violence seeks to influence policy through terror, who pays the heaviest price, the powerful or the innocent? These are not rhetorical curiosities, but realities for the people who lived through these years. Farmers whose fields went untilled, merchants whose caravans were rerouted or destroyed, families who lost fathers and sons to reprisals. History that focuses only on tactics and outcomes overlooks this cost at our peril. In the end, the clash between the secret order and the Mongol war machine left a mixed inheritance. The Mongols pulverized a centralized capacity for politically directed assassination in the Iranian highlands and sent a signal across the region about the limits of shelter for those who harbored covert actors. The assassins' direct capacity to influence politics from Alamut-level bases was curtailed, but the concept, small groups using precise violence to shape policy, survived in memory and in practice among actors of different kinds. The story thus becomes less an argument that one method won, and more an account of a shifting balance. Visible force can crush institutions, invisible force can unsettle empires, both can produce suffering beyond the battlefield. So what should we take away as we close this chapter? First, that fear is a strategic instrument with real effects. It can slow armies, disrupt logistics, and change decisions at the highest levels. Second, that countering an invisible threat often requires measures that invade private life and can inflict broad civilian harm. Third, that the historical record, fractured, partisan, and sometimes sensationalized, demands careful reading and an ethic of caution when drawing definitive claims. Perhaps the final image worth holding is a quiet one. Long after the stones of Alamut lay broken or repurposed, stories of blades at night remained. Villages would tell them to travelers, chroniclers would record them as puzzles of power. That persistence suggests something like an afterlife for methods as well as memories. Tactics can be dismantled, but ideas about how to make the powerful vulnerable linger, migrate, and adapt to new circumstances. If this exploration raised questions for you about how secrecy and spectacle shape war, or how societies balance security and rights, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the darker mechanics of history, and tell us which episode you'd like to see next.